and welcome back to Global PayFest 26. My name's Natalie Lloyd, I'm from JGA Recruitment, and I'm joined today by Alina Timofeeva, CEO of Unique Bold You. Hi Alina, how are you? Welcome.
Hi. Thank you so much, Natalie, for having me with you today. So I am in Saudi Arabia. I am in Riyadh. I'm a British citizen. I have been working across UK, Europe, but more recently I've been in Saudi Arabia, so I can tell you all about it and about the use of AI here in terms of HR and payroll. So in terms of my work, I run my own technology company, which is called Unique Bold You, because we very much focus on technology and humanity. So a big portion there is, with the use of AI, how can we be more influential, more ethical, and, more human? Before this, I used to work in KPMG, Oliver Wyman, and Accenture, which are large tier 1 consultancies. So I've done a lot of work around transformation, workforce transformation, digital transformation, organization transformation. So I hope today, I can answer some of your questions, Natalie, in terms of what's happening in Saudi Arabia, but more importantly, what this means for HR, for the payroll in the context of AI first future and generally, humanity.
Amazing, thank you. Because I really like when we were chatting and we were building this session together, is that you really focused in on AI not being a technology transformation, but being a human one. And I think that's going to come across again and again, sort of as we talk today. I think we can start off really, really nicely with Saudi Arabia as an example. So how can AI accelerate Saudi's human capital ambitions under that Vision 2030, not just to improve productivity, but also to expand opportunity in the region?
So first of all, Natalie, Vision 2030 is transforming the whole kingdom. So it goes across the people, technology, and culture, and the changes are happening absolutely everywhere. So it's across the workforce, across the women, the youth, across the whole population. So if we look at AI, it's not just, automating tasks or making them more efficient. As you noticed, it's not just the technology change, it's the whole organizational operating model change. So the opportunity for us right now is not just to build the tools or to build, some of the products or to make them simpler, faster, more efficient, but to really transform from the human side, how the humans in Saudi Arabia and beyond are essentially experiencing AI. So for me, the very three big areas are, number one is education and skills development. Number two is, the job creation, the workforce expansion, the augmentation of the current roles. And number three is equity and inclusion. So if I just give you a few examples, if I think about education, there is a massive program by Sadaya, which is a data and AI regulator in Saudi Arabia, which is targeting to upskill, more than several million people in the space. I think today they have already rolled out education to 1 million Saudis, and the targets are as high as 3 million. What they're doing is that they're partnering with the global firms like Microsoft, like AWS in terms of helping upskill the workforce, but they're doing a very unique thing in terms of focusing on the Vision 2030, doing it with the touch of the culture, the touch of Saudi Arabia, so that it's not just the English education, coming to Saudi Arabia. The second part, in terms of equity and inclusion, there was a lot of focus on women, right? So there is a specific KPI which is being measured in terms of women in the workforce, and it has been growing. I believe at the moment it's around 35% of people in the workforce are women. But essentially, AI can be a growth lever here as well, because AI can make the workforce more accessible and, makes sure that the women who enter the workforce, they can, learn the new skills and develop the opportunities much faster than if they didn't have access to AI. And then I think that the third thing in terms of workforce inclusion and expansion, so there are so many programs that we have around entrepreneurship. So even if you are an entrepreneur and you have an idea which will benefit the kingdom, there are different programs in terms of getting you support, getting you to have an premium residency, for example, if you want to live in Saudi Arabia, having you an opportunity to work, with the Saudi experts, but also get the education from US, from abroad, getting access to the tools, etc. So I think AI here again has an opportunity in terms of, AI is one of the part of all those tools which are being developed as part of the entrepreneurship, but also it's one of the tools to accelerate the entrepreneurship as such. So I feel like that there is a lot of happening, and one of the biggest uniqueness of Saudi Arabia is it's all happening at scale, which is why, we can always look at it as a case study and kind of draw different lessons learned into what we are doing in other countries.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you think the way that Saudi Arabia are doing things could help define more of a global model for human-centered AI?
Yeah, so I think definitely there is a lot of capital coming into Saudi Arabia, so there is a lot of focus. There is a lot of focus which doesn't just come in silos, but it comes from top to bottom. So to give you an idea, everything is being measured. So we have more than 200 government entities, and each one of them needs to report on the AI adoption. And then all these KPIs are being monitored and measured. And, obviously before 2030, you have to hit certain targets. Also, from the leadership perspective, if they hit the targets, their compensation is also, linked to hitting those targets. So I think that's in terms of AI, in terms of the whole global model. Specifically for the human side, right, we have a new company which is backed by PIF, backed by the government, backed by like the large entities, which is called Humane. And the idea is, whilst it's developing the national infrastructure for AI in terms of building the data centers, like it has different partnerships with Qualcomm, with a lot of the US and foreign providers, it's actually focusing on the life of the Saudis and redesigning it to be more, human-centered, value creation, etc. So they have different projects. One, for example, is about medicine. How can healthcare transform using AI? Or, of course, there are different examples which I mentioned in terms of the workforce, in terms of how the citizens are experiencing some of the government services. And they're working, to make it more human-centric, which you can also see from their name, Humane. And essentially, they are bringing the technology and the human together. I think what is very, very important here is, however we look at it, it's very important to focus on trust. And if we just look at AI as a technology, yes, there is resilience, there is technology resilience, but it's actually the trust, whether we as humans can trust AI, not to take away our jobs, but to actually make us more, efficient, create a better future. This trust is essentially what we should focus on in terms of scaling the human-centered AI. And I feel that from HR and payroll perspective, this is essentially, where we should be spending much more effort in terms of redesigning the processes, the workflow, and, the end-to-end organization.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, HR and payroll are two of those functions in the business that really, really touch each individual in the workforce. So what do you think global payroll, global HR leaders can learn from Saudi Arabia's pace, that pace of digital transformation and institutional transformation?
Yeah, so I will focus on 4 key lessons. I think that there are many more potentially, but I'll try to structure in terms of the scale, the people, and, the measurement. So if we talk about the scale, obviously there is a lot being driven by the government. So there is a lot of government-led digital ecosystem. And what I see here is people are really enthusiastic because so much change is happening at the same time. So there is a sense of unity. There is a sense that people really want to transform, right? Even though historically, perhaps they were a little bit behind in terms of the data, the legacy systems, etc. So what I see from HR perspective is that there are different platforms driven by the government, for example, Kiva, which is for labor market services, or there is Mudat, which is payroll compliance. So it is streamlining the HR processes and it's making them more digital as a first step but also is putting AI on top of it. So I feel that the key lesson here is that it's investing into integrated AI, HR technology stacks to reduce the bureaucracy, but also to not have it as siloed, that each of the organizations is trying to do something different, but kind of helping, from the top down in terms of the frameworks, the tools, the approaches. So this is the first one. The second one, which I mentioned in terms of the people, there is a massive upskilling which is happening. To be honest, a lot of it is targeted at Saudi national, right? So there is a lot of Saudization, which you may have heard about. And there are different programs like Future Skills Initiative, for example. There are partnerships with Accenture, Microsoft, Coursera to reskill the citizens in AI, cybersecurity, all the other digital topics. So I see both the programs which are more smaller, like hackathons, to kind of larger ones when citizens are being sent abroad, or they're giving access to like Harvard education or, good education in terms of upskilling. Also in terms of the day-to-day work, they're getting trainings and they're getting opportunities to develop as much as possible. So I feel that the lesson here is the partnership with the, educational technology platforms like Coursera, perhaps, or governments or general academics to enable the continuous learning. Because one of the things which about AI, every day something is happening. There is like a new tool, there is again another tool, there is something, somebody does another version. So it's very hard to just learn it once and stay up to date. So there is a lot around continuous learning, right? And then the third thing which I want to focus on is measurement. Right. So what I found historically during my times in consultancy is a lot of the processes in an organization are legacy driven. And when it's legacy driven, only certain things are being measured, right? So it can be the performance of the system, or it can be the number of incidents, but actually it's not always data driven, planning, or data driven workforce planning, or data driven measurement, which allow us to see their insights both at the bottom, but also on the very top from the leadership perspective, from the board perspective. So I feel that something which is happening in Saudi, like I'm just looking at my notes, there is Takat, AI-powered job matching in terms of some of the labor market dashboards. So that's to predict the demand for roles like data scientists, for example. But generally, there is this whole concept, in addition to measuring, to having data to measure. And the more you can measure, the more you can govern. And then obviously you can see the progress later on. So I feel that the key takeaway here is to see that in addition to redesigning the processes and the behaviors and the culture, whether indeed you can start thinking about the data, how you measure things, and do it on a continuous basis.
Yeah, absolutely. Alina, a question I had is around project success. So I know when we look at AI projects, about 87% of those fail. So is the problem there the technology, or is it the leadership?
Yeah, so there are different statistics which you may have read in the press. Some say 87%, some say as much as 95%. So it really depends how you measure it. But the essence is that there are very many initiatives which are being started. There are so much money coming in. The budgets, are happening. And we get a lot of questions from the CFOs, perhaps, when am I going to see the value creation? When am I going to see the change? So to answer your question, if we look at the technology, there are only ever so many providers which we're using in terms of their AI. And of course, technology continues to evolve, and you keep hearing about the data centers and about investments into technology. But I think technology at the moment is at the point where we can already use it quite well, for simpler tasks, for medium tasks, maybe not for something, completely breakthrough, but you don't need this breakthrough in a normal day-to-day organization. So I feel that to answer your question, there is a lot of focus on the leadership and how they adopt AI. Some of the statistics I have is, multiple organizations, 88% of organizations are experimenting with AI, but only 81 see the bottom line value. 86% are not prepared for day-to-day adoption. and only 14% report that leaders are actually championing AI with a clear strategy. So I think this example essentially tells us that the challenge is not technology, it's the leadership, it's the operating model and the trust. And just the final thought on this, if you think about the organization, it's like a system. So everything is interconnected. So it's very hard to say we're going to automate this particular thing. We're going to buy a tool off the market and a particular technology, and therefore our organization will transform. What essentially happens is, because it's a social system, we can't just use the concept of the technology shift. It's a fundamental redesign of how organizations operate, and that's again how the HR and the payroll leaders come into this.
Amazing. And we hear in our industry all the time, every event you go to, every talk you go to, they're talking about how HR leaders and payroll leaders can automate that kind of manual, long, annoying work that takes a lot of focus. Now, is that the only way organizations are using AI, or are they actually genuinely using it to redesign the way work gets done?
Yeah, so something on this topic, we have been trying to automate the processes for as long as I've been doing technology. So there were different technologies. For example, there used to be RPA, there was automation, now it's AI. So ultimately the sentiment is we want to spend less time on repetitive tasks. We want to enjoy our life more. We want to be more creative, right? And that's the sentiment which I see across the world. Now, fundamentally, what's happening is there was a big push on AI from the governments, from the leaders, and people started adopting. They started, in many cases, buying the SaaS tools and then plugging them into the existing legacy work. And some of the examples, people would say, okay, I use AI to automate my scheduling, or I use Copilot, or I use GPT or something similar to kind of summarize the tasks and find things fast and do the research. But this is fundamentally not the transformation, and this is not, why companies are pouring billions and millions of dollars into AI, right? So, for example, McKinsey argues that for every $1 spent on technology, as much as $5 need to be invested into the people, the processes, the redesign, and more importantly, the change management. So something which I see on my end is probably, if I look at the transformation, only 10% of it is technology, 20% is data, because I'm sure you've heard that data needs to be better if you want to, get better insights. But 70% is the change management. And that's essentially one of the biggest challenges, because currently, coming to the point that many projects fail, they fail because AI adoption is very, very fragmented, right? So many organizations are trying pilots, or even they are successful, but just in the smaller parts. But essentially, we are looking for end-to-end redesign. We are looking not just at the legacy system redesign, but at the whole, the people, the processes, the culture, which is, again, coming back to HR and the payroll, something which we need to focus on longer term.
For sure. And another question we hear again and again is, is AI going to take away our jobs? Like, are we all going to be made redundant and everything's going to be robots? Obviously, organizations are more and more bringing in those kind of intelligent agents into the workforce. How can HR leaders and payroll leaders prepare individuals in the workforce to not panic and actually work alongside the AI?
Yeah, so something I just want to start by explaining the difference between the AI, which we tend to use now, and agentic AI, just for clarity. So the AI which we typically use, such as GPT or Claude or something similar, it's more looking at the history, right? It's almost like a search. I know it's much more intelligent than that, but we are looking at the data, which is historic data, and we are coming up with different ways of showing the information, whether on slides or in terms of the research, or, there are some suggestions and views and opinions. But this is kind of the old state of AI, which I know we are still adopting. The next stage is agentic AI. So the idea of the agentic AI is that the agents can actually do the end-to-end process flow. So, they can do the end-to-end task, not the task which we are researching how to do, but they actually go step by step and do it. And as an outcome, you get some sort of value creation depending on the task. And then in the next advanced level, the agents talk to each other and they communicate with each other. There is the traceability in terms of how they communicate, and they can get the stuff done. So that's in the ideal case. Now, this will take a little bit time, because even though technology may be there and there are many companies who are showing that it may be possible, the actual implementation of this in the company will take time, because there is a lot of legacy within the company that you have to redesign all the processes, as we discussed, right? But more importantly, there is this whole adoption of how the humans and agentic AI will work together. So in principle, it all starts with the leadership, because with the leadership, it's no longer going to be, managing individuals in terms of labor, but it's a much more human-centric leadership in terms of trust, judgment, adaptability, psychological safety. Those qualities would be super important. And from HR perspective, I would probably say that one of the first initiatives is, focusing on the leadership in the age of AI and how their role is going to change. I feel that there is a very big focus on the vision, because historically we used to try to automate what we already have. But if we look at AI, whatever direction you go, whether it's AI for good or AI for bad, AI essentially just amplifies it. So AI can be like a bad coffee, which spoils your day, or it could be something positive. So some of the challenges which I see so far is people are just automating or looking, very much in the bottom in terms of how to do things, but they're not really thinking about the vision, right? And if you start with a vision, there is a possibility to think much broader. If I have humans and if I have agentic AIs, what are those agentic AIs going to do versus what the humans will do? And then you redesign the role of the humans so that it's maybe more flexible and it's more, combined and united, rather than, just cutting down the people, which is not the right approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And as AI kind of grows and becomes, more competent at different tasks within the workforce, what are those kind of key human capabilities and human traits that are going to become more and more valuable, and how should HR teams react to that?
Yeah, so I feel one of the key things, whilst many people are talking about AI and how it's going to change our life, the main thing is AI is not really as intelligent, right? Because it doesn't show us that it thinks. It reports what has been done before. And that's why, we keep hearing that if the data is bad, the decision is bad. So it's not like some sort of human created, meaning, purpose, influence, identity. It's helping us historically, right? So AI is accelerating the human creativity, but it's not replacing it. And for everyone to actually be successful in their career, I feel that there are three key things. So number one is vision, which is what I mentioned before, because we need to have the meaning, the purpose, the why, in terms of why we're doing things. The second one is the identity, the personality, in terms of what we are becoming, not just how we're doing this. And the third is influence. So it's the ability to tell the stories, to move the people, to shape decisions, something which you can't, just automate or, have an identical twin and just, replace yourself. So I feel that a lot of the qualities that need to be remunerated and rewarded and, ultimately being measured are things like judgment, problem solving, negotiation, decision making. So these are the things which perhaps even as a human in the loop, we will need to exercise quite a lot on AI, but this is, more importantly, what enables us to stay human.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you mentioned in there about AI doesn't think for itself, it only does what it's learned. I think that's really, really important to take into consideration, whether you're working, well, in any business function, but particularly, in HR and payroll, where your actions and what you do affect every single person in the workforce. A funny kind of example is that one time, like when I very first got a Claude account and I was like, fiddling around with it, seeing what it could do, I asked it for a recipe. And I was like, oh, I'm going to make some pasta tonight. This is the stuff I like. Can you write me out a recipe? And now, all the time when I ask it questions, it's like, so I remember that you like tagliatelle. And I'm like, okay, you've just like based my whole personality on me making pasta one time. So it can work the same way as if you put a wrong bit of data into your AI, every decision moving forward is going to be based on that bit of data. It's not going to learn that it's wrong by itself. It's going to just keep growing and growing that bad bit of data until it becomes really bad, right?
Yeah, so I think what happens with AI, it amplifies whatever you tell it, right? So first of all, there have been different stories about AI companions, AI girlfriends, etc. So they don't really have, feelings for you. Like it's a trained data, right? And you can take the data in different ways, and the scenario you may have may be different from my scenario. Therefore, the response can be different. Also, I have been testing, for example, DeepSeek, which is a Chinese version of AI, they respond to questions differently than GPT, and GPT responds a little bit differently than Perplexity, and it responds even differently from Claude, even though I'm asking the same question. And some of it may have to do is the point at which I started interacting with them, how much they knew about me before, but also, different AIs, depending on the model and depending on their input, they may give you a different response. The biggest thing here, and I think this is very, very important for some of our future questions, AI does make mistakes, AI fails. AI seems to be very positive and very affirmative that, whatever it says is completely trustful, but actually it's not. And the experience I've had recently is I had a visa in Saudi Arabia, and AI has told me that I can be in the country 90 days and then leave and then come back and then leave and come back. So I've been doing all of that, and then I almost got deported because it wasn't actually 90 days like leave and come back. It was 90 days in total. But it was telling it to me so confidently, and in fact somebody else was citing it to me so confidently that you are not even encouraged to go and to check it. And sometimes it's just the wording as well of how it writes it, because in different languages it may translate in different ways. So you should always have this human touch in terms of verifying what it is. And there are different things maybe for next time that you can do in terms of questioning the hypothesis behind AI, making sure that it's not going, too positive or too negative, but it actually stays as fair, well, within how fair it can be, but as unbiased as possible.
Yeah, definitely. I always try to put into it as well, like, don't just agree with me. Even though I know it's still not making its own opinion, I'm like, don't only say yes. Okay, so taking it back to a HR perspective, payroll perspective, how can performance, reward, workforce models evolve as AI becomes more and more a part of that operating model?
So I will go into a few examples, but in terms of the high level, if we think about the performance, I feel given that what we've been talking about humans and agents, we will need to evaluate the human AI collaboration longer term. In terms of the rewards, there is a lot of focus on the less technical skills, like the more human skills, which we have just mentioned, like problem solving, cooperation, collaboration, negotiation. So there is perhaps, thinking about rewards for the skills and for the impact and not just the skills. Now, in terms of the workforce design, I think longer term we'll have to see, precisely who's doing what, because if the agent is doing part of the job, then the human job, you can't just erode it completely, but you need to redesign how they work together. And I think that the fourth pillar, which is super, super important, which comes over and over again, is the ethics. Because so far, again, depending on which model you use, depending on which tool, but this has been widely cited, there are lots of biases, there are lots of ethical issues, there are lots of, uses, like deepfakes, crime, different abuse of people, but even in the workforce, there could be different things which impact the hiring decision, the promoting decision, maybe if you have any complaints, right? So you always need to have this focus on the ethics, right? And I feel that the ethics is a pillar which goes across, whether it's performance or awards and workforce. And if I just go into my notes, I think, for the specifics, some of the companies, and I'm sure this is not just a few, so Saudi Aramco, it's supporting, employees who certify in AI-related roles, right? So there is a lot of focus right now on upskilling, reskilling. So there is a lot of focus, can you actually, work in the AI first world? Do you have AI literacy? I think on the people, there needs to be more focus on the ethics as well. So if there is any training or anything that you can do on the ethics side, more practical than just explaining you have to be ethical in AI. So I think that's going to be something that we have to measure. I think the second thing is, we talked about different biases which may happen, right? So it's very, very important to think about the transparency within the system, right? So if there is a decision which is being made, we need to always have an understanding within the AI, if we are using AI for that, what was the rationale for that decision? And it's not just for the audit purposes, it's actually for a human like me in the loop, to be in the loop and to read all of those decisions and to make an understanding, whether indeed this is true or this is not true, because AI makes mistakes, as I mentioned, and the examples I've given you, they can really make your life completely horrible. And we shouldn't, just reward AI for being assertive and saying in a very positive way, some nonsense. I feel that there is also an element in terms of work charts. So work charts, it's thinking about the dynamic teams, flexible teams around tasks, right? So if we think about humans, ideally we want to take away the repetitive tasks. So the things where we spend a lot of time, chasing people, or putting things in calendar, or calling somebody without a response. So we want to get rid of it. So AI can do it. But ultimately the goal is to elevate humans to do more value creative stuff, right? And so that their creativity and all the influence and everything else actually continues to evolve, right? So I would definitely focus in terms of any of the metrics on the impact, right? There's not so much how much time you spend at work in terms of hours, but more the innovation contributions, the satisfaction of customers, their influence, the quality, the ethics. I think all these human-centric qualities will be very key in terms of, being measured, but more importantly, being applauded in future.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there, Alina. And something we hear quite a lot in the payroll industry is that payroll is now becoming less about processing and more about becoming a strategic function. So how is it that HR leaders and payroll leaders can kind of make that shift away from being process owners to being like guardians of trust in an AI first future?
So something which I have observed is generally the whole organization, not just HR and payroll, but generally all the roles, for example, the role of the CFO or the role of the CIO has more recently started moving into value creation, right? So it's now no longer only managing finance for a CFO, but kind of being this creator of value. And I feel that the direction of value is going to continue as much as possible within the AI world. So there is the value and the trust, right? So I feel that the biggest challenge in terms of this whole transformation is the change management. It's getting the buying from the people. It's, having an opportunity to gain that trust from the people. So even now, some of the media that we see doesn't really help, because you see the news that such and such has laid off 30,000 people, 10,000 people, 8,000 people, right? And people are now unemployed and all this money is going into AI. This sort of narrative doesn't really help adopt human plus AI operating model. I think there will be a lot of opposition in terms of the AI, to be honest, after such news. But in terms of the positive things, there are certain things that HR would need to champion. So it's championing championing the ethical, the transparent operating model. It's championing the fact that as a human, you're going to spend less time on the repetitive tasks and more on value creation, right? It's making sure that humans are not replaced, so they're not seen as a, cost cutting because of AI, but it's actually more as the value creation, and you need to have the human in the loop, to make those decisions, to make those strategic decisions, to negotiate. I think one of the questions I once had is, if you make people redundant, is the government going to support them with unemployment benefits, right? So that they can actually upskill. So, hopefully you should already start upskilling people now, because you would upskill them to be more value creative, already now, instead of, first getting rid of them, putting AI, and then, those people trying to get upskilled, because it just creates a very bad economical situation. And I feel on the trust specifically, there should be certain things which are being measured. So, and what gets measured is something which we can actually govern and improve. So there are things like productivity gains, which is the most typical metric, but on the trust, it can be employee sentiment to fairness. It can be, if there are any issues or concerns, how they are being resolved, how fair they're being resolved, how fast they're being resolved. Right, there may be certain things in terms of the tasks which the people are creating, maybe their job satisfaction. So we should be looking into that area rather than just saying, we had X number of jobs and now we have Y number of jobs and therefore we have saved that.
Yeah, and then in terms of decision making, for a while now, people, individuals, workforces, organizations, they have been making small decisions by AI, right? What are some of those decisions that we should absolutely never, ever, ever let an algorithm make the decision for?
Yeah, so something which I mentioned, which is very, very critical, is two things. Number one, AI learns from historical data. So everything what could have been biased before, where you have a challenge in terms of trust, in terms of transparency, all of that will still be there if it wasn't in historical data. In particular, if you are a global organization and you have different countries, the data which is feeding from different countries is very, very different. Right? And if I take things like GPT, it was originally trained on Reddit data, which was very biased. It was not really, thought to be clean and, nice, etc. So this is not the right place to make critical decisions around hiring, paying, promotion. Perhaps there is also, discrimination or some of those concerns raised by their employees. So you should always have the human in the loop. This is the first part. The second part, which I mentioned, is AI makes mistakes. Even, when I prepare for certain things, like in my work, I can ask AI the same question. It tells me one thing, and it kind of makes it super clear, and that it's like 100% sure. Then I ask it again after 10 minutes, and it tells me a completely opposite thing. And exactly, it's again very, very sure. So I've even had instances, like very simple terms. I was doing a proposal for the client, right? And I was trying to figure out, what I should position, how I should position, what I should say, what I shouldn't say. And I'm like, AI was criticizing first my work, then I changed it, then it was criticizing the work which I changed and asking me to do exactly what I had before, right? But the thing is, because it's talking with such a unique, the confidence, right? You actually keep thinking that indeed, it's so certain. And I'm sure that they're now trying to add more voice to AI as well. Soon it's going to be like just in your head that it's so certain. But actually, it's not true. I've seen instances where, something which I mentioned, that AI should be like a true librarian. So we should have all the information behind in terms of how it made decision. But sometimes it shows you all the decisions it made and it looks very nice. And then you click and it's not there. Like the thing when you try to verify it, it's actually when you go and read it, it's either it doesn't exist or it's there, but it doesn't say what it says it's going to say. So the reason I'm giving all these examples is that there are different issues which may not be seen on the front end that easily, but when you dig into it, they prevail. And they prevail even more in geographies which are not as advanced as, for example, US, just because, you know, the data is scarce, the access is different, etc. So to answer your question, in terms of the things that shouldn't be delegated. Easy tasks, you know, like calendar scheduling, where let's say you have a threshold in terms of having a mistake, yes, you can delegate, right? The more critical tasks, like if you have a grievance, for example, if you have any discrimination cases or promotion cases of hiring or paying, perhaps you could use AI to inform some of it, but you should always look through it and you should make a decision. Perhaps you can use, you know, like check against these laws and regulations and those laws and regulations and, you know, this opinion and that opinion, but you should always go and not just on the surface in terms of saying yes or no, but kind of go behind it, whether there could have been mistakes. And actually also try, if you've done it once, to try to do it once again, or maybe using a different model if you have access to a different model, because your response may be quite different. And then you may want to check, you know, just once again with somebody else.
Yeah. And then the other thing is that, like I've asked it to do things before, like, you know, to find me some information or whatever, and it will come up and it will be like, yeah, like this is a percentage, this is a stat, this is where it came from, blah, 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 blah. And then I say, like, can you like send me the link to where I can find that information? And they're like, no, just made it up. And it looks so real, and it's so easy to believe that that is real, but it's just like,
Yes. And another thing which is very important is AI is also different depending on where it's being built. So for example, if I take GPT, which is a free version, right, it's trained by all the data in the internet. So this means that the data is polluted. So even if you have, you know, some chats where people are discussing something, but there is no source behind it, it would still pick up that information. And then what happens is on top of it, it comes up with some additional judgment and it puts the hypothesis. So to give you an idea, when I was preparing for this talk, I was asking about different Saudi initiatives, right? And it was giving me like this whole load of Saudi initiatives where everybody is doing. But when I actually asked it, you know, can you prove me? Because I'm not aware of those initiatives. And they were like, no, it's just a hypothesis, because we thought that, you know, that's going to be logical for Saudi to do, but it's not actually happening in real time. So you should always check, but even if you find the source, you should also check the source, because it's not going to sites like Wikipedia, for example, because Wikipedia, behind Wikipedia, everybody goes and checks the precise source and then they try to make it very neutral. Whereas with AI, it becomes, you know, it can go in different ways. So you can't just take and copy paste it and say, yes, that's the truth.
Yeah, totally get that. So in terms of AI being less of like an opinion and more of something you can actually trust, what would trusted AI look like in practice for payroll teams, HR teams, and particularly the leaders in those functions?
Yeah, so I think that there are certain things which people should focus on. So if I think about a framework, there are probably 6 key pillars. So number 1, human oversight. So however you call it, human oversight, human in the loop. So even if we get to the next model of AI, which is, you know, fancy and trending and expensive and exciting, we should always have the human judgment on top. Because I'm sure you've heard about cases where, you know, there was a case of AI potentially being used in military in the US. You know, you can't give certain decisions to AI because there can be mistakes which are being made, right? So the human oversight. So number 2 is the data and the privacy. So something which is very important in terms of HR is obviously HR, you know, saves the organization from the legal risk, right? And if we think about data and privacy, we need to think quite a lot in terms of what data is being accessed, how it's being accessed. Is it accessed in an ethical way? Because otherwise you can be sued by your employees if you have access to something and then it feeds somebody else's model, right? And then in some shape or form it comes outside. I think the third part is governance. So governance is very, very important. And the governance has this part around monitoring and measuring and, the transparency, the explainability. So I think the governance, there is a more technical side of it in terms of what I mentioned, that you have those descriptions, that's how the machine made the mistake. But ultimately, we as humans, we are responsible for their actions, because if this goes to a court case, there is no way you're going to say, oh, AI told me this, therefore AI will be liable for this fine. So it's going to be a human who is liable, and AI is just a tool which may expedite your tasks. And sometimes I find that I spend so much time verifying things that actually it's not making my life easier. I'm spending much more time verifying than, I would have done from the start in terms of doing the work. So then the fourth pillar is the bias and fairness. So as I already explained, the data which historically went into AI was quite biased and not very fair because of how it was, used in terms of training the model, but also just there were different KPIs in terms of which data is accessible, which data is available. There are different statistics that, for example, women are less likely to use AI because they don't trust it, or, there is much less information about certain geographies, certain nationalities, certain types of underrepresented groups. So there is always going to be a bias and fairness, concept which you need to think about. And this is particularly very important for your employees, which are from marginalized groups, because you can't just say that AI will treat them in the same way. So the fifth part is transparency and explainability, which I think we talked about. But I feel that the big thing here is AI can make failures, right? And you have to prepare for those glitches. So you can't just assume that something is decided by the machine, because employees should know why a recommendation was made. And if they challenge you and ask you, you need to be prepared why this was the case. And the last one is monitoring. So there are different monitoring things which you can do. You can monitor, in simplistic ways, how many processes and tasks are being, automated, where you have AI assisted, how you are being trained. But more importantly, you need to think about, this compliance, this trustworthiness, the fairness, right? And to actually measure that, you will always have to compare against the human evaluation, because there is no way you can compare it right now in terms of fairness of machine versus the machine. So you would have to at least sample, and you will have to see that whatever the metrics you are measuring, your measurement and your, baseline is correct. And it has to be renewed, and it needs to be remediated when things are not doing well.
Yeah, it's not something you can just sort of do once and forget about. So Alina, in terms of governance, how does governance have to evolve as AI becomes more and more embedded into workforce decision making?
Yeah, so some of the statistics which I have is, there are different forums. For example, some organizations, they do the AI governance forums, and the AI governance forums or AI governance board, or it can be part of ethical and risk committees. You would have somebody from HR as part of it. So it will be across the different representatives of the organization, but HR in some shape or form need to be part of it, because we need to oversee the workforce AI. Now, what is very interesting is only 24%, there was one of the recent McKinsey reports about the future of work, the future of, the workforce. They say only 24% of people who they, asked cite ethical and compliance guidelines as important to adoption. But this is a very, very big gap, right? Because ultimately, we can't look at governance as a compliance only. It has to think about the ethical guidelines, very much so. So historically, what I've seen with a lot of the forums before, when we started cloud adoption, or when we started some of the technology adoptions, they were very much, policies and processes driven. So it was like, okay, we got together, we made some decisions, we have the risk management, the standards, we have the controls in place, but there was less focus on the ethics, just because ethics didn't really come up so much at the time. But with AI specifically, as I mentioned in the very start, ethics needs to be measured, and it needs to be the core part of the governance. And it needs to be not just, a thing on the slide. It has to be embedded throughout the values, throughout the trainings, throughout the discussions with the employee. Because in the same way as you wouldn't let an unqualified doctor, operate on the patient, you wouldn't want an unethical person, operating with the AI, because a lot of mistakes can be made, and then the detriment will be very, very big. I think in terms of the other things, in terms of governance, so there are obviously the risk management framework, there are the standards. I feel that there is a big focus there on thinking that some tasks are much more easier or less risky, so you can apply there much more. So I don't know, let's say calendar invites, or like summarization of something which is not highly critical or confidential information. This is kind of lower ROI, so you can use AI with perhaps a little bit less human oversight. But something critical like promotions and pay reviews, etc., like you have to use much more of human oversight. I think the second big thing is the clear roles and responsibilities. So I feel if you are the chief HRO or, head of HR, you may be chairing the governance board, which I mentioned, but then somebody like a chief data officer or chief AI officer, they will be enforcing the standards. And then from the legal risk perspective, you ensure the compliance. So I think that we should always ask who owns the AI decision and what happens if the decision goes wrong, and who's going to own this mistake. This is very, very important. And I think the last part is about the measurement, right? Because whatever the decisions are, there should always be a review in some shape or form, either of everything or of in parts, because there have been things when AI was already trained, it was reviewed, but then there is something called like catastrophic AI, which means that for some reason, the model changed or some of the technology behind changed, and it actually went backwards, right? Even though it was trained to be less biased, etc. So you should always keep this in mind, that it's not yet at the stage where 100% everything works correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. So when AI does fail, what does resilience look like for like really, really workforce critical functions like HR, like payroll?
Yeah, so I feel like we think about resilience. Historically, resilience used to be seen just as a technology concept. So for example, you have a cyber incident, and then, you remediate certain things, and it's a technology thing. But with the AI, we have a concept of operational resilience. This is essentially the technology, the people, and the culture. And the people and the culture are super, super, super important. So what is key in terms of the resilience is probably three key things. So number one, there should never be like a fully 100% automation by AI. You should always have human in the loops, because AI makes mistakes. Number two, and this is what organizations haven't really been doing, they design the worst case scenarios, but they don't always test them. So I think that it's very important to test for those worst case scenarios in practice before the catastrophe happens, because otherwise it will happen and you don't know how to communicate it. And I think that the third part is it's culture over technology. So whatever the results you get, you should always train the people in terms of questioning the outputs, something that we discussed before, that you can't just blindly trust them and assume that this is a fully true. So there should be a lot of thinking in terms of how your employees can question AI outputs, but also, if they find something, they shouldn't be penalized for it, because it's part of the learning process of the AI first organization. I'm sure that there are many other things, but I think in principle, all these checks, whether it's human in the loop or bias audits or reviewing the hiring tool or reviewing the decisions, this is very, very important, in particular as the technology matures and as the processes are being redesigned.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, we're nearly at the hour, but I wanted to cover one more kind of point I think is really, really important, and that's that kind of human future in a world where AI keeps growing and growing and growing. So we've touched on inequality in the workforce. Now, will AI help to reduce that, or will it deepen it, do you think?
So it depends, to be honest, because it depends on who, controls the technology. It depends on the choices which we make. It depends on the strategies. So one of the biggest thing, if I just give you an example, we talk a lot about GPT, but not everybody has access to GPT. There are 800,000 users of OpenAI globally. Many of them are using, a free service. Only 5% are actually paying, $20 or $200 for the service. But a lot of the people don't actually have access to AI. So this is already an example of the inequality, right? At the same time, we see models like DeepSeek. They just released a new model yesterday, which they made, much cheaper than even the previous model which they had. And the idea there is, more people are going to have access and, hopefully they are going to benefit from AI. But when I look at AI, there are two big things. There is the AI where access is given to like masses of people. And then there is a more niche AI where you actually have the value creation. And the value creation is, where it's not summarizing things, but it's like where it's really reliable, it's really safe, it's trustworthy, it can make ethical decisions, it can literally, help with the inequality. So I feel that the mass AI, there are different ways how it can become accessible by lowering the prices, by having competition in. But the value creation AI, this huge AI, which really makes a difference, it's still being developed, right? And this is why I'm saying that those who are making the decisions, those, the policies which we define as the organization, the workforce strategies, is something which is very, very, very important. Because something which I have observed is the opportunity so far hasn't yet really been democratized. So there is a concept of digital colonization where, somebody like US have more access to AI than somebody in Africa, for example. But it's also, if we look about women, or underrepresented groups, not everybody has the same access. Perhaps not everybody has the same skills, or perhaps they're not wanting to use it in the same way. So, ultimately, we want to have exposure of, that no human is left behind in terms of this transformation. So as much as possible, we want to make sure that there is equality, but we have seen quite a lot of inequality. And if we continue on the path on which, we have seen it, it's likely to deepen the inequality. Maybe not within the same organization, but perhaps in a different geography, or perhaps for certain groups like underrepresented groups. And I'll just finish by saying that, AI is not just a tool, it's not just a technology, it's an opportunity to solve some of the structural economic issues. And, we don't want to create inequality. We want to encourage the growth. We want to have the growth. We want to have the opportunity, some of the things I've been talking about earlier in my speech. We want to have, the trust. We want to have the ability to create things. So this year, over the last 12 months, I had an opportunity to travel, around 15 countries and speak in those countries. So what I see that the humanity, they really want to benefit from AI, like they want it to enable us to be more influential and more creative and more nice, etc. Right? So AI could really be this opportunity, but ultimately it's about how we, transform it, how we use it day to day, and what are the choices we're going to make together.
Yeah, Alina, I love that. And that's such a lovely message to finish the session on as well, is that, AI is here to make things better, here to make things not only easier for people, but to improve and to, reduce inequality, to open up doors for opportunity for everyone, no matter their demographic. I think it's really important that people keep that in mind as well, because like you said, and it's something, to be honest, that I've never really thought about, is that AI kind of just presumes that everybody in the whole wide world uses AI, because that's where all this information comes from. So yeah, there's definitely a million miles to go. But it's about having the right minds behind building those AI infrastructures in an organization to make sure that it's doing the right thing. So Alina, thank you so much for joining us today. You are absolutely amazing. Like a fountain of knowledge.
Thank you.
And I think our viewers are going to go away having learned so much. And just having some kind of key questions to consider themselves as well when they're using AI in their HR function, in their payroll function. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us. And to everyone watching, thank you all for tuning in for our Saudi session. Alina, is there anything else you wanted to mention before we go?
Yeah, I would just say, I am in Saudi at the moment, so I'm writing different points of views in terms of what's happening in Saudi. I put them on my LinkedIn so we can connect there. I'm also doing quite a lot of travels around the world. Like I went to Pakistan, to broader Middle East, and, I post some of the views how AI can be experienced differently by humanity in different parts of the world. So I think if you are interested, let's connect, because I'm doing, my best in terms of having much more access to equal information. And it's really a pleasure to be with you here today. And I look forward to staying in touch.
Alina, you are amazing. Thank you so much. And to everyone watching, see you in the next session. Bye.